consciousness is a much more profound state of trance than the hypnotic state. And yes, we do need to wake up from it.
In fact, there has been a suggestion that I find very intriguing. Charles Tart presented a paper to the Anthropological Society saying that really we are hypnotized almost from birth by our culture, by our parents. That's how we learn language. That's how we become socialized, isn't it, in fact, through hypnosis?
Yes. You know, the strange thing is that the Eastern psychologies, Buddhism or Hinduism particularly, have the idea that we live in a state of illusion. They call it samsara or maya. And they don't really mean that the world is illusory, but that we have such distorted perceptions of it that we live in an illusion or a dream of our own creating. Now, the funny thing is that while we don't have this idea in Western psychology, we actually know more about the nuts and bolts of living in illusion than the Easterners do. All our research about the nature of the unconscious, about the way perception is a relatively arbitrary construction, works out the mechanisms of Maya or samsara, tells us exactly how we live in a dream. I've tried to combine some of these ideas in my Waking Up book because I think we desperately need to know that the state of consciousness we ordinarily walk around in is not some simple, natural, sane state. It's a very arbitrary, very biased, very slanted construction which is marvelous for some things, but quite terrible for other things. And until you question your ordinary consciousness and realize there are other potentials that you're distorting in your ordinary state, until you question it, there's nothing you can do about it.
Can you give me an example of, for example, for people who are viewing right now in a presumably ordinary state of consciousness, TV watching, what might be some of the inherent dangers there?
Well, we'll skip the question of whether TV consciousness is an ordinary state of consciousness or not.
It's common, let's put it that way.
It's common, yes, it's certainly common. Let's take an interesting example. We all believe that we have will, that we can carry out our decisions. Well, that's true occasionally, but how many times did each of us have some very important emotional revelation or insight about the way we were living our life and decide deeply in our heart of hearts that we were going to change? And one day later, if that long, we forgot about it. Why can't we even remember our emotional knowledge, our emotional insights, much less have the will to carry it out? That's the kind of question people have to ask themselves. And it's the kind of ability we can develop if we work at it. But ordinary life, ordinary education will not help us do that. Shame. If people knew what you did, you would be so ashamed. That's pretty good, but it has a little out. If you can get away with it and nobody knows it was you, you're tempted. The superego is one step better, because even if nobody else knows, you know and God knows. And so you get punished for even thinking about doing things.
Now let me just sidestep or take a little side road here for a second. Are you suggesting that in some of these primitive cultures people don't have superegos, that it's something unique to our culture?
It's certainly not unique to our culture, but yes, there are some cultures in which the superego is a very minor part of a given person's mind. Our culture today is mixed on it. We've drifted more toward a shame sort of culture, where what the public knows, what other people know is more important, but we were primarily a superego culture. And of course that comes from our whole Judeo-Christian heritage. You know, God is watching.
So guilt is, and the fear of punishment of the superego is one of the forces that mitigates against self-observation.
Right.
Are there some other major obstacles to self-observation?
Oh, sure. We're not taught to do it. The whole culture gives us a picture that we're not good, so we don't want to look. I mean, you know, the Freudian notion, for instance, that basically we're wild animals with a thin veneer of civilization on top keeping us from running amok. I mean, who wants to look inside if that's
all
the picture?
Sex and aggression.
Right. Or if you're born in original sin and basically you're rotten and going to hell, who wants to look at that? So our culture's invented a multitude of ways to distract yourself from ever having to look inside. But the result is that although we apparently avoid the pain of seeing what we fear we'll see, we then go on to really mess up our lives because we don't know ourselves. We don't know what we're really like. We don't know what we really want. We don't know our resources well. and we make mistakes.
And yet we have this ancient philosophical tradition, which I think at least goes back to Socrates, where he says, "Man, know thyself." And yet, you know, when I studied philosophy in college, there was none of that.
You didn't have Introspection 101 and 102?
None at all.
Okay.
No. Introspection is outlawed even in psychology pretty much these days.
And, you know, not only is it effectively banned, but we don't have the skill to introspect very well. You know, it's one thing to tell somebody, start observing yourself, see how you really feel, what's really going on. But if people take that seriously, what they often find is that it's very hard to concentrate. Their attention drifts, they get confused as to what they're looking at, and pretty soon they end up watching TV and distracting themselves again.
You know what you're saying reminds me of an episode as an undergraduate psychology student back at the University of Wisconsin in the 60s. I helped form the Psychology Students Association. I was elected to be the vice president when I gave a little speech in which I said, I became a psychology major in order to know myself. And I'm not learning anything here in this department.
I bet your fellow students loved it, and it didn't go over well with the faculty.
I got a standing ovation at the time, but I doubt, or I don't know, that there's been much change in academic psychology since then either.
Not much. I mean, there's been a little bit of loosening up. I mean, even the behaviorists now talk about verbal reports of fantasy behavior or something, but still no recognition that we need to systematically observe our own minds.
I would think, you know, that ultimately this should be the goal of psychology.
I wouldn't want to make it as the goal, because, you know, we have learned a lot by concentrating on observing people from the outside.
Yeah.
See, one of the things when you practice self-observation that you learn is that you fool yourself, that you're a very biased observer. And to get the feedback from somebody else can be so helpful. I mean, for instance, take a classic case of in therapy. Somebody goes into therapy and the therapist tries to find out the problem. And they say something like, do you get along with your father? And the client says, yeah, I get along just fine. The therapist says, oh, really? No problems at all? No. Now, the client isn't observing himself very well. In fact, now there are systematic psychological blocks to his knowing that. But the therapist can see there's a big discrepancy between the behavior and the report, and that suggests a line of work that you might learn a lot from. So we need both. We need feedback from other people as to how they perceive us, as well as learning to perceive ourselves from the inside.
Well, is the art of self-observation, is that the goal of any discipline at all?
No. No. Many spiritual disciplines put very little emphasis on self-observation, because they already know what's right, and they simply give you a prescription. You behave according to this set of rules, and that's what salvation is about. Or many spiritual disciplines practice in a very biased self-observation. It's a superego type of thing. You know, here are the sins you have to watch out for. So you become very sensitized to signs of those. The kind of self-observation I'm talking about involves making a commitment to learn the truth about yourself and your world, no matter what it is. Not to observe yourself to catch yourself in your sins. Not to observe yourself only when you happen to be doing something you like. Not to observe yourself in order to support what you already believe, but to try to observe yourself and your world to see what really is. And that's a commitment. I like to quote a famous American spiritual leader of a sort there, Patrick Henry. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. If you aren't vigilant about yourself with a commitment to knowing reality as it is, you'll build up fantasies. You'll live in this state that I call consensus trance. Right? You're lost in fantasies, and they're widely shared in the culture. Everybody else has similar fantasies. So we all think we're normal, but we're seriously cut off from the world around us and do a lot of stupid things as a result.
And yet it seems to me that there's a paradox there, because not only is the world as it is, but it is as we create it.
That's
We're
right.
not just passive in this process.
That's right. One of the things you learn from observing yourself is that you aren't just taking it in. You're looking at this and not that. You're selectively listening to this part of the conversation and not the other. But that's fine. That's what you're seeking to learn. How do I run my psychological machinery, as it were? And you see that, and you say, okay, can I see it more clearly? Can I see what's behind that? What else can I learn about this? But again, it has to be done with this commitment to I'll accept whatever I learn. It can't be, I'd like to have an insight that shows me how wonderful I am or what an awful sinner I am. It has to be, I want to see what's in myself. I'm looking for the truth. And the truth is very rewarding in a subtle kind of way. You know, even if you don't like what you see in yourself, and I don't know how many times, you know, in practicing self-observation, I've seen things in myself that I don't like at all, that I'm ashamed of. And yet there's a sort of authenticity that comes from the fact that you know you're trying to be as honest as you can. And that's satisfying.
I would think that there might be something to the Hegelian notion of a dialectic, where you come to a point of view about yourself, and then you might notice, well, that the opposite point of view is also true sometimes, and then you begin to develop a synthesis, and then discover something in opposition to that synthesis, and so on.
And sometimes, before that synthesis, you have to live with the opposition for a long period of time. Let's get concrete. I'll give you an example of self-observation, which I began doing systematically many years ago. I began to notice my mental attitude when I was driving. And I realized that I was very angry at drivers who did not follow the rules. If they followed too closely behind me or cut in too closely in front of me, I didn't like that. In fact, as I observed it more, I realized I was so angry that I wanted them to die. I mean, anybody who followed me too closely and threatened my life deserved to die. Well, it was hard to make that observation. I didn't like it because I think of myself as a kind, understanding person and all that. But there it was, and I was going to stick with it and watch it for a few more times till it went away. Well, it wouldn't go away for 3 years. Every time I got in the car, part of me wanted to kill whenever anybody followed too close.
Interesting.
And it didn't matter that I didn't like it. I had to stay with it. Eventually, keeping the focus of consciousness there made some changes occur.
So what you're saying is that simply by observing yourself that way, you can't change yourself.
Well, sometimes observation alone will change yourself. Yes, there's a lot of things that, in a psychological sense, aren't very potent. They're not hooked in with real deep, powerful emotions. They're habits of thought and feeling and perception. And they have to run in the dark, as it were, without too much consciousness. And once the light of consciousness is put on them, 2 or 3 times, something like that, they just sort of fade away.
I mean, you can chase away the little imps, but not the big demons.
Some of those things you find won't go away, and you have to commit yourself to observing them even more closely. Observe the feeling states associated with them. And eventually you may get some insights to make them go away, or you may have to eventually get yourself involved in some kind of training or discipline to specifically do something about those kinds of things.
So now when you drive the car, you don't get that way anymore. Is that right?
It's not anywhere near as bad now. I don't pay as much attention to it. Now I get mad at the people who don't signal their left-hand turns until they're actually making the turn when you haven't had time to move over into the other lane. No, when I first started self-observation, I thought, right, I should be able to do this for a month and become a perfect being. But it's a long haul.